Hello all, it's Jim Johnson, aka Sulfur Blade, and I'm going to apologize right now. This video is going to be a little longer than my normal video, and I'm going to be using various different sources as I typically do, but there's going to be a couple of them from Tucker here. In my last video, one of the commenters demanded that I show the proof of voter fraud that he claims that there's none of, that it's just bunk. And I challenge that that person has been watching far too much lamestream TV. So my first proof of voter fraud are two of my personal relatives that I descend from. Both voted in the state of Wisconsin for Joe Biden this year, and they were both very much in the ground and dead, to include my grandfather. So this is not a charge I make lightly, and I'm not a fan of what has transpired. So let's go ahead and start off with some information from Tucker to set the groundwork of this video.
In this case, tonight, there's only one way to lower the national temperature and unite the country. We need to find out exactly what happened in this election. And there are questions, and that means we have to answer them. For example, in Pennsylvania, Nevada, and Michigan, the Trump campaign has now collected signed affidavits that attest to criminal activity during the voting process. In the city of Detroit, witnesses have alleged, under oath, that ballots were improperly backdated and counted without matching signatures. One poll watcher alleges that 40,000 late unsealed absentee ballots were counted orally, and all of them went for Democrats. In the state of Nevada, 8 whistleblowers from within the Nevada Election Department say they witnessed voter fraud abetted by other election officials and by their supervisors. According to one affidavit, a poll worker saw people bringing handfuls of ballots to a Biden-Harris campaign van. Those ballots were then filled out at the van, placed in return envelopes. Eventually, Biden's supporters formed a wall to block outsiders from seeing what they were doing. Meanwhile, according to voting records, people who were not even alive still somehow managed to vote on Tuesday. In New York, deceased voters cast absentee ballots. On October 9th in Nevada, a man called Fred Stokes Jr. mailed in his vote. The only problem was Fred Stokes Jr. died 3 years ago at the age of 92. The Republican Party of Nevada says it is aware of hundreds of other potential cases of dead people casting ballots. In Pennsylvania, records show turnout from several people who were born in the 19th century. They apparently rose from their graves to vote. Now, all of that is real. We spent all weekend checking it. False claims of fraud can be every bit as destructive as the fraud itself, so we need to be careful and responsible.
All right, so that's just to set the groundwork of what this video is going to be about, and that is that there is obvious voter fraud across the country, especially in the swing states. Now, I just want to point out some common sense math. One would think in this election, with historic voter turnout, where Biden magically won all these swing states, that if people loved Biden so much in the swing states, they obviously loved Biden in the world of blue America, like California and New York, where this election is not being questioned. One would think that that would make sense, right? Obviously, if Biden won these swing states, then he must have gotten more voters than normal in the land of the blue. Well, let's look at it. Let's take a look at Los Angeles. In Los Angeles, Biden got less votes than Clinton. Trump actually went up 4 points in the biggest city in the land of the blue on the West Coast. How about New York? Look at this. We see the same thing. Biden down, Trump up. Broward, Florida. Biden down, Trump up. Okay, Broward, Florida isn't necessarily the land of the blue, but it's still still a deep blue county in a very populated county, right? This is how things have worked out. For whatever reason, Trump had historic voter turnout all over the country and got more votes than normal all over the country, with the exception of the swing states. Magically, Wayne County, where is Wayne County? Right there. Look at this. Biden up. Oh, Trump up a little bit. But overall, just lots of up. So not only did Biden go up, but Trump went up. Sounds kind of fishy, right? You have 2-3 percentage points more votes casted this year in Wayne County than last year. How many more votes is that than, let's say, Los Angeles here? Did Los Angeles have a historic voter turnout? Well, I guess you could say that there was 4 points more votes because Trump got 4 points and Clinton only lost about 0.6. Alright. Maybe I'm not making the argument perfect here, but you see what I'm talking about. Why is it that the biggest cities in the swing states, Milwaukee, Pennsylvania, or not Pennsylvania, Philadelphia in Pennsylvania, Milwaukee in Wisconsin, and Detroit in Michigan, all went Super Biden this year to the tune of just enough votes to push their state over the top at the very last second? Not fishy at all, right? And that's why we find stuff like this to be very disheartening.
Well, I just think we have to be very clear. She's charging, the other side is welcoming fraud and welcoming illegal voting. Unless she has more details to back that up, I can't in good countenance continue showing you this. I want to make sure that maybe they do have something to back that up, but that's an explosive charge to make, that the other side is effectively rigging and cheating. If she does bring proof of that, of course, we'll take you back.
That was Fox News. Can you believe that? That was some bullshit, wasn't it? What was she going to bring up? She was going to bring up the affidavits.
Right, I did, Sean. We keep hearing the drumbeat of where is the evidence. Right here, Sean. 234 pages of sworn affidavits. These are real people, real allegation, signed with notaries who are alleging the following, among other contentions. They are alleging, this is one county, Wayne County, Michigan. They are saying that there was a batch of ballots where 60% had the same signature. They are saying that 35 ballots had no voter record, but they were counted anyway. That 50 ballots were run multiple times through a tabulation machine. That one woman said her son was deceased, but nevertheless somehow voted. These are one of many, many allegations in one county, in a county no less, where our poll watchers were in many cases threatened with racial harassment. They were pushed out of the way, and Democrat challengers were handing out documents how to distract GOP challengers. These are real, and anyone who cares about transparency and the integrity of the system should want this to pursue to the discovery phase.
So that's about what she was going to say before she was cut off so rudely by Cavuto. How about this one? Since there's, this is local.
People mistakenly being counted, we began hearing from state lawmakers saying they're ready to get involved and work on a solution.
The saying goes, dead men don't talk, but evidently in Macomb County, dead men do talk.
That was Clinton Township Clerk Kim Meltzer's response to an alarming discovery on November 9th, days after the election. In an exclusive interview telling us the Macomb County Clerk's office delayed mailing her death certificates of people who'd passed away between October 9th and 26th. The result, Their 10 absentee votes sent out before their deaths still being counted, a violation of Michigan law.
There just was not enough notification quick enough to make sure that those voters who cast their ballots early, who then passed away, did not have those ballots counted.
See how that worked? One clerk didn't send in the death certificates until after the election. Was that an honest mistake? Was that clerk just swamped and didn't get around to getting her work done until after the election? It's possible. Certainly. It doesn't have to be nefarious, though it certainly looks nefarious. Or how about this one? These look a little bit more nefarious to me.
Cast by a woman called Deborah Jean Christensen. It'd be hard to find anyone who's got a bad word to say about Deborah Jean Christensen. She was well known in her community for years as a bird watcher, an avid gardener, a committed fan of the Georgia Bulldogs. Those who knew her were sad when she died last May, and they might be surprised to learn that even after her death, Deborah Jean Christensen still managed to register to vote and then cast a ballot, presumably for Joe Biden. In some ways, it's an inspiring story, the triumph of voting over death. And no one quite embodies that story like Jaames Blaylock of Covington, Georgia. Mr. Blaylock was a mailman for 33 years until he passed away in 2006. 14 years later, according to state records, he was still mailing things. Jaames Blaylock cast a ballot in last week's election. How did he do that? It might be worth asking the New York Times. Maybe Jaames Blaylock was just one of those extraordinary mail carriers. Neither rain, nor snow, nor gloom of night, nor even death itself could keep him from the mail. In his case, maybe voting from the grave wasn't really fraud, it was just commitment. Okay, but what about Linda Kessler of Nicholson, Georgia? Linda Kessler died in 2003. 17 years later, she was still voting in presidential elections. Edward Swinott of Trenton, Georgia, spent his life working construction and teaching school. In his spare time, he loved bluegrass music. According to those who knew him, he played multiple instruments and enjoyed jam sessions. When he died 5 years ago at the age of 82, it seemed like he was gone from this world for good. But no, last week he voted for president. And he wasn't the only one. On your screen right now, you will see the names of other deceased voters. Every one of them played a role in last week's presidential election. As of tonight, there aren't enough of them to alter the outcome. That could change as we learn more. But for the moment, the point is, they exist. They are dead, but they voted anyway. The question is, how did they do that? How exactly did they cast their ballots? And the short answer is, by mail. Dead people tend to vote more often when you make it easier for them to vote. They're like any other group. And this year, we made it much easier for the dead to vote. States sent ballots and registration forms to millions of people totally unsolicited. The pretext was COVID. We had to do this for public health reasons, remember? We had no choice. It was a public health emergency. The effect was to encourage fraud. One 2012 study by Pew found there were close to 2 million dead people still on voter rolls around this country. That study also found that approximately 24 million voter registrations, that is 1 out of every 8 in America, were wrong. They were no longer valid, or they were significantly incorrect. Close to 3 million people in America had registrations in more than one state. 3 million. So what happens if you start sending ballots and registrations to lists like this?
Indeed, what happens when you start mass mailing ballots that haven't been requested all over states like this? Well, you get the 2020 election. And that's how we've gotten to this point. But you know, there's no proof of voter fraud. It's nowhere to be found at all. Except for the signed affidavits. Here's a very interesting one. This is over in the state of Michigan. This is an affidavit. The affiant Zachary Larson, being first duly sworn, hereby deposes and states as follows. My name is Zachary Larson. I am over the age of 18, have personal knowledge of the facts stated in the affidavit, If sworn as a witness, I am competent to testify to these facts. I am an attorney in private practice. Seems to be someone who might be rather in touch with the law in Michigan and knows that the penalty for falsifying an accusation in the state of Michigan is 10 years. Perjury is a pretty harsh charge in Michigan, and that's where he's signing this affidavit as an attorney in record who obviously understands what's on the line, but he's making the statement anyway. Prior to my entry into private practice, I served as an assistant attorney general for 8 years, from January 2012 through January 2020. Oh, well, gee, this is someone we can't trust at all. Okay, this is I'm being facetious there. This is obviously an upstanding member of the community. Were I recognized with an award for quality of my work and served the state on several high-priority litigation matters. In September 2020, I volunteered to serve as a poll challenger doing his civic duty for the Michigan Republican Party's Election Day operations to ensure the integrity of the vote and conformity of the election process to the election laws of Michigan. In preparation for my service, I attended an election training, reviewed materials relating to the conduct of elections, and read pertinent sections of Michigan election law. So he did his due diligence, as you would expect someone of his stature to do. On Election Day, Tuesday, November 3rd, 2020, I served as a roving attorney and credentialed poll challenger with a group of attorneys and visited approximately 20 to 30 voting precincts in Lansing, East Lansing, and Williamston, Michigan, to confirm that the election was conducted in accordance with law, and on few occasions to address complaints raised by specific voters. During my visit to precincts on Election Day, I was allowed to visually inspect the poll book without touching it at every precinct where we asked to review it. In each instance, I was allowed to stand a respectful distance behind the election officials while remaining close enough to read relevant names and numbers. The following day, on Wednesday, November 4th, 2020, I arrived at the former Cobo Center, now known as the TCF Center in Detroit, Michigan, to serve as a poll challenger for the absent voter count occurring in Detroit, and arrived between 9:30 and 9:45 a.m. Prior to my admission to the floor where the absent voter counts was occurring, I received credentials from the Michigan Republican Party and further instructions regarding the process for handling ballots at absent voter count boards. Thereafter, I received a temperature scan from election officials that confirmed I did not have an elevated temperature. I arrived inside and was checked in by an election official who reviewed my driver's license and confirmed my credentials and eligibility to serve as a challenger. I was admitted at approximately 10:30 a.m. When I arrived at the counting table and began to observe the process, I noticed immediately that part of the process that was being implemented did not conform to what I had been told in my training and materials that I had received. Specifically, the information I had received described the process that was supposed to be occurring at the tables as follows. At first, election officials would scan a ballot. If the scan did not confirm a voter in the poll book, that official would then check the voter against the paper copy supplemental poll book. The official would then read the ballot number to a second election official and hand the ballot to the official who would remove the ballot while still in the secrecy sleeve and confirm the ballot number. That second official would then hand the ballot in the secrecy sleeve to the third official, who would tear the stub off the ballot and place the stub in a ballot stub envelope, then pass the remaining ballots to a fourth official. The fourth official would then remove the ballot from the secrecy sleeve, flatten the ballot to ensure it was capable of processing, and visually inspect for rips, tears, or stains before placing the ballot in the ballots to be tabulated box. However, in that fourth official identified a concern, she would place the ballot back in its envelope and into the problem ballot box that required additional attention to determine whether they would be processed and counted. A copy of a diagram that I had received on this process is attached as Exhibit A in this affidavit. What I observed immediately was that the secrecy of the ballot was not being respected. Instead, the second official at the table where I was observing was repeatedly placing her finger on the secrecy sleeve to separate the envelope and visually peek into the envelope in a way that would allow her to visually observe the ballot and identify some of the votes cast by the voter. Sometimes the third official, whose job was merely to remove the stub from the ballot, would likewise remove the ballot from the secrecy sleeve or otherwise peek to observe the ballot. Sometimes the ballot would be removed completely from the secrecy sleeve and then placed back inside and passed along this process. I conferred regarding this issue with another challenger at a nearby table, and he indicated that he had observed similar irregularities regarding the use of the secrecy sleeve. When the challenger raised the issue with the supervisor, and he was immediately asked, why does it matter and what difference does it make? Beyond the legal requirements for maintaining ballot secrecy, both of us were concerned that the violations of the secrecy of the ballot that we witnessed could be or were being used to manipulate which ballots were placed in the problem ballot box. Later that morning at another table, a challenger identified concerns that ballots were being placed into problem ballot boxes purportedly based on the reason that the voter had failed to place the ballot in the secrecy sleeve, while other ballots at the same table were being passed along and placed into the ballots to be tabulated box that also did not have secrecy sleeves. I personally observed that several ballots were placed into the problem ballot box and marked with a sticky note indicating that they were problem ballots merely because of the lack of a secrecy sleeve. When I spoke with the supervisor regarding this issue, he explained that these ballots were being placed in the problem box for efficiency. From my experience at the first table I had visited, addressed in paragraph 15 through 17, I had also witnessed a ballot that was placed into the ballots to be tabulated box that had arrived without a secrecy sleeve. So the differentiation among these ballots, despite both ballots arriving in secrecy sleeves, was perplexing and again raised concerns that some ballots were being marked as problem ballots based on who the person had voted for rather than on any legitimate concern about the ability to count and process the ballot appropriately. Just before noon, I arrived at another table, which I later contemporaneously noted as AVCB number 23, and I conferred with the Republican challenger who had been observing the process from a viewing screen and watching the response of the computer system as ballots were scanned by the first official. I asked the challenger if she had observed anything of concern, and she immediately noted that she had seen many ballots scanned that did not register in the poll book, but that were nonetheless processed. Because she needed to leave for lunch, I agreed to watch her table. As I watched the process, I was sensitive to her concern that ballots were being processed without confirmation that the voter was an eligible voter in the poll book, so I stood at the monitor and watched. The first ballot scanned came in as a match to the eligible voters, but the next several ballots that were scanned did not match any eligible voter in the poll book. When the scan came up empty, and the first official would type in the name Pope, that brought up a voter by the last name, I reviewed the running list of scanned-in ballots in the computer system, and it appeared that the voter had already been counted as having voted. Then the first official appeared to assign a number to a different voter, as I observed a completely different name that was added to the list of voters at the bottom of the running tab of processed ballots on the right side of the screen. That same official would then make a handwritten notation on her supplemental poll book, which was a hard copy list that she had in front of her at the table. The supplemental poll book appeared to be a relatively small list. I was concerned that this practice of assigning names and numbers indicated that a ballot was being counted for a non-eligible voter who was not in either the poll book or the supplemental poll book. From my observations of the computer screen, the voters were certainly not in the official poll book. Moreover, this appeared to be a case for the majority of voters whose ballots I had personally observed being scanned. Because of this concern, I stepped behind the table and walked over to a spot behind where the first official was conducting her work. Understanding health concerns due to COVID-19, I attempted to stand as far away from this official as I reasonably could while also being able to visually observe the names on the supplemental poll book on the envelope. Partially inhibiting my abilities to keep a distance, the tables were situated so that 2 counting tables were likely a maximum of 8 feet apart. In other words, you could not stand more than 4 feet behind one without being less than 4 feet from another. As soon as I moved to a location where I could observe the process by which the first official at this table was confirming the eligibility of the votes to vote, the first official immediately stopped working and glared at me. I stood still until she began to loudly and aggressively tell me that I could not stand where I was standing. She indicated that I needed to remain in front of the computer screen. I responded, "Ma'am, I'm allowed by statute to observe the process." As I did, a Democratic challenger ran towards me and approached within 2 feet of me, saying, "You cannot speak to her. You are not allowed to talk to her." I responded, "Sir, she spoke to me. I was just answering her." The first official again told me the only place I was allowed to observe from was at the computer screen. A second official at the table reiterated this and said that was not true. Both officials then began to tell me that because of COVID, I need to be 6 feet away from the table. I responded that I could not see and read the supplemental poll book from 6 feet away, but I was attempting to keep my distance to the extent possible. Just minutes before, at another table, a supervisor had explained that the rules allowed me to visually observe what I needed to see and then step back away. Likewise, on Election Day, I had been allowed to stand an equivalent distance from poll books in Lansing and East Lansing precincts without any problem. With this understanding, I remained in a position where I would be able to observe the supplemental poll book until I could do so for the voter whose ballot had just been scanned and did not register in the poll book. Both officials indicated that I could not remain in a position that would allow me to observe their activities, and they were going to get their supervisor. This seemed particularly concerning because the Democratic challenger who raised concerns over my verbal response to the official had been positioned behind the second official, the one who confirms ballots as described in paragraph 13. No further away than I was from the first official at that time, and had not been stationed at the computer screen, as the officials repeatedly told me was the only place that I could stay. When the supervisor arrived, she reiterated that I was not allowed to stand behind the official with the supplemental poll book, and I needed to stand in front of the computer screen. I told her that was not true, and I was statutorily allowed to observe the process, including the poll book. The supervisor then pivoted to arguing that I was not 6 feet away from the first official. I told her I was attempting to remain as far away as I could while still being able to read the names in the poll book. In an attempt to address her concern, I took a further step away from the table and indicated I would try to keep my distance and that I thought I was about 6 feet away from the first official. The supervisor then stood next to the chair immediately to the left of the first official and indicated that I was not 6 feet away from the supervisor and that she intended to sit in the chair next to the official with the poll book, so I would need to leave. This supervisor had not been at the table at any time during the process, and she had responsibility for numerous ACVBs. Further, the supervisor's choice of chairs was approximately 3 feet to the left of the first official, and therefore in violation of the 6-foot distance rule. Accordingly, I understood that this was a ruse to keep me away from a place where I could observe the confirmation of names in the supplemental poll book. The supervisor began to repeatedly tell me that I needed to leave, so I responded that I would go speak with someone else or fill out a challenge form. I went to find another attorney serving as a challenger and returned to discuss the matter further with the supervisor. When I returned, she reiterated her assertion and insisted that there was nowhere where I could stand in conformity with the 6-foot rule that would allow me to observe the supplemental poll book. Ultimately, to avoid further conflict with the supervisor, I agreed that I would leave the counting table and move to another table. Between 1:30 p.m. and 2 p.m., my colleague and I decided to return to the suite that housed the Republican challengers to get lunch. We left the counting floor and went up to the Republican second floor suite. About 30 to 45 minutes later, an announcement was made that challengers needed to return to the floor. As we attempted to return, we were made aware that the officials admitting people had limited the number of election challengers to another 52 people who would be allowed inside. I displayed my credentials and walked up to near the door where a small crowd was gathered to be let in. Shortly thereafter, a man came out to announce that no one would be let in despite the prior announcement. Because the room had reached maximum number of challengers, as he was asked why we would not be let in, he explained that the maximum number of challengers were determined from the number of names in the sign-in sheet, regardless of how many people had left the room. Many Republican challengers had left the room for lunch without signing out, including myself and my colleague. Accordingly, we were arbitrarily counted towards this capacity limitation without actually being allowed into the room to observe. When challengers raised this issue with the man at the door, he refused to discuss any solutions as confirming the identity of challengers who had been previously admitted. To the best of my recollection, I was never informed that I left the room and failed to sign out, that I would be refused admission, or that there would be no means of confirming that I had been previously admitted. The above information is true to the best of my information knowledge and belief. Further, Affiant says. So that's one example. Here's another example. My name is Jesse Jacob. I'm an adult citizen and resident of the state of Michigan. I've been an employee for the city of Detroit for decades. I decided to work in the elections department in the 2020 election. I received training from the city of Detroit and state of Michigan regarding the election process. I worked at the election headquarters for most of September, and I started working at a satellite location for most of October 2020. I processed absentee ballot packages to be sent to voters while I worked at the election headquarters in September 2020 along with 70 to 80 other poll workers. I was instructed by my supervisor to adjust the mailing date of these absentee ballot packages to be dated earlier than they were actually sent. The supervisor was making an announcement for all workers to engage in this practice. At the satellite location, I processed voter registration and issued absentee ballots for people to vote in person at the location. I directly observed on a daily basis City of Detroit election workers and employees coaching and trying to coach voters to vote for Joe Biden and the Democrat Party. I witnessed these workers and employees encouraging voters to do straight Democrat ballot. I witnessed these election workers and employees going over to the voter booth with voters in order to watch them vote and coach them for whom to vote. During the last 2 weeks while working on the satellite location, I was specifically instructed by my supervisor not to ask for driver's license or any photo ID when a person was trying to vote. I observed a large number of people who came to the satellite location to vote in person, but they had already applied for an absentee ballot. These people were allowed to vote in person and were not required to return the mail absentee ballot or sign an affidavit that the voter lost the mailed absentee ballot. Whenever I processed an absentee voter application or in-person registration, I was instructed to input the person's name and date of birth into the qualified voter file system. The QVF system can be accessed and edited by any election processor with proper credentials in the state of Michigan at any time and from any location with internet access. I worked at satellite locations until the poll closed on November 3rd, 2020 at 8 p.m. and properly completed the entry of all absentee ballots into the QVF by 8:30 p.m. I then returned to work at the TCF Center on November 4th, 2020 at 8:30 a.m. to process ballots. I was instructed not to validate any ballots and not to look for any deficiency in the ballots. Absentee ballots that were received in the mail would have the voter's signature on the envelope. While I was at the TCF Center, I was instructed not to look at any of the signatures on the absentee ballots, and I was instructed not to compare the signature of the absentee ballot with the signature on file. All absentee ballots that existed were required to be inputted into the QVF system by 9 p.m. on November 3rd, 2020. This was required to be done in order to have a final list of absentee voters who returned their ballots prior to 8 p.m. on November 3rd, 2020. In order to have enough time to process the absentee ballots, all satellites were instructed to collect the absentee ballots from the drop box once every hour on November 3rd, 2020. On November 4th, 2020, I was instructed to improperly predate the absentee ballots received date that were not in the QVF as if they had been received on or before November 3rd, 2020. I was told to alter the information in the QVF to falsely show that the absentee ballots had been received in time to be valid. I estimate that this was done to thousands of ballots. The above information is true to the best of my information, knowledge, and belief. Further affiant, says not Jesse Jacob. There's a lot more of these. I could read and I could read and I could read, but rather than waste all of your time, I'm just going to cut it there. So again, to the individual in my previous video alleging that there was no voter fraud at all, I strongly disagree with your allegation. And furthermore, I assert that until all legal remedies have worked themselves through the court, that Joe Biden is not the president-elect, that call is far too early to make, and it's very likely that President Trump will remain the president of the United States once all legal votes have been counted and all illegal votes have been discarded. So stick that in your craw and smoke it. Anyway, I'm James Johnson, aka Sulfurblade. This is my content. Hopefully you're enjoying it. If so, please leave a like and subscribe. And until the next time, all, peace.